After days of national mourning, President Hichilema just made an official announcement, and Zambia has a lot to say about it. Was it too soon? Watch what happened. President Hakainde Hichilema has officially declared an end to the national mourning period held in honor of late former President Edgar Chagwa Lungu. The announcement has sparked mixed emotions across Zambia and the diaspora. In this video, we break down Small Blue Diamond, the official statement by President HH. Small Blue Diamond, public reaction from across Zambia. Small Blue Diamond, what this means for the legacy of Edgar Lungu. Small Blue Diamond, how political leaders and citizens are responding. Whether you support HH or Lungu, this moment marks a significant transition in Zambia's national history. Watch the full breakdown and join the conversation below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-time political updates from Africa. Detailed analysis of President Hichilema's statement and its implications. The official statement by President Hakainde Hichilema. On June 19, 2025, President Hakainde Hichilema delivered a somber address to the nation, marking the conclusion of a 14-day national mourning period for Zambia's 6th President Edgar Chagwa Lungu, who passed away on June 5, 2025, at the age of 68 in Pretoria, South Africa. The statement, broadcast live across state and private media, was a carefully crafted attempt to navigate the unprecedented political and emotional complexities surrounding Lungu's death and the subsequent disputes over his funeral arrangements. Hichilema expressed condolences to Lungu's family, the Patriotic Front (PF) party, and the nation, emphasizing Lungu's contributions as a statesman who served Zambia from 2015 to 2021. He called for unity, urging Zambians to set aside differences and honor Lungu with dignity, compassion, and respect. The statement detailed the government's efforts to coordinate with the South African government and Lungu's family for the repatriation of his remains and a state funeral. Hichilema revealed that an agreement had been reached with the family for a state funeral on June 22, 2025, complete with military honors, and that preparations were underway for the body to be repatriated on June 18, 2025. However, he expressed regret that last-minute changes by the Lungu family disrupted these plans, leaving the government unable to proceed as intended. Without directly criticizing the family, Hichilema alluded to the challenges posed by conflicting directives, particularly the family's insistence on a private funeral and their claim that Lungu had explicitly requested that Hichilema not be involved in his funeral arrangements. Hichilema's address also addressed accusations from the PF and Lungu supporters that the government had mismanaged the process or disrespected Lungu's wishes. He clarified that the government respected the family's role, but maintained that the funeral of a former head of state was a national matter governed by state protocols. He cited the involvement of senior officials, including Foreign Minister Malambo Haimbi and Secretary to the Cabinet Patrick Kangwa, in negotiations with the family and South African authorities. The statement concluded with a plea for calm, urging Zambians to avoid divisive rhetoric and to work toward a resolution that honors Lungu's legacy and strengthens national unity. The tone of the statement was conciliatory yet firm, reflecting Hichilema's attempt to balance respect for Lungu's memory with the need to assert governmental authority. However, the mention of the family's disruptions and the government's disappointment hinted at underlying tensions which have fueled public and political debates. The statement's timing, 14 days after Lungu's death, was also significant, as it came amid growing public frustration over the prolonged uncertainty surrounding the funeral arrangements. Public reaction from across Zambia. The public reaction to Lungu's death and the funeral controversy has been deeply emotional, polarized, and reflective of Zambia's complex socio-political dynamics. As a predominantly Christian nation, Zambia observes mourning periods with solemnity, and Lungu's passing elicited widespread grief, particularly among his supporters in the PF strongholds of Lusaka, Copperbelt, and northern provinces. Radio stations across the country played gospel music for weeks, and public spaces saw gatherings of mourners, many wearing black or white as a sign of respect. However, the dispute over funeral arrangements has transformed this grief into a mix of confusion, anger, and division. The government's designation of a state-owned lodge in Lusaka as the official mourning venue clashed with the PF's directive for mourners to gather at its headquarters, creating logistical confusion. Many Zambians, particularly in rural areas with limited access to real-time information, were unsure where or how to pay their respects. This was compounded by the lack of clarity about the repatriation of Lungu's remains, which remained in South Africa due to the standoff between the government and the family. Social media platforms, particularly X, have been a key space for public sentiment. Supporters of Hichilema, such as at Katso_Lazarine, praised his leadership, arguing that his decision to end the mourning period and push for a state funeral demonstrated statesmanship despite resistance from the PF. Others, like at Zambian Voice, expressed frustration with the government's handling of the situation, accusing it of failing to communicate effectively or respect Lungu's wishes. Posts from PF-aligned accounts, such as at PF Youth Wing, amplified the family's narrative, claiming that Hichilema's government was attempting to control Lungu's funeral for political gain. An open letter by Thandai Uketi Zengoma, published in the Zambian Observer, captured the anger of Lungu's supporters. titled An Open Letter to President Hakainde Hichilema. It accused Hichilema of systematic cruelty toward Lungu, alleging that his administration's actions, such as restricting Lungu's travel for medical treatment, surveilling him, and pursuing legal cases against him, contributed to his death. The letter went viral, resonating with PF supporters who viewed Lungu as a victim of political persecution. Responses to the letter on X and other platforms were polarized. Some called it a powerful indictment of Hichilema's leadership, while others dismissed it as exaggerated, pointing to Lungu's own governance failures, such as Zambia's 2020 debt default and allegations of corruption. In contrast, Hichilema's supporters argue that the government has acted responsibly under challenging circumstances. They point to the economic recovery efforts under Hichilema, including debt restructuring deals, as evidence of his commitment to Zambia's progress, contrasting this with Lungu's economic mismanagement. Public rallies organized by the United Party for National Development (UPND) in Lusaka and Southern Province have seen citizens express support for Hichilema's call for unity, though these events have been criticized by the PF as politicizing the mourning period. The division in public sentiment reflects Zambia's broader political polarization, with Lungu's death serving as a flashpoint for unresolved tensions between the UPND and PF. Urban areas like Lusaka and Kitwe have seen small protests by PF supporters demanding respect for Lungu's wishes, while rural communities less exposed to the political rhetoric have focused on traditional mourning practices. The lack of a unified national response has left many Zambians feeling that the mourning process has been tainted by politics. What this means for the legacy of Edgar Lungu. Edgar Lungu's legacy is a tapestry of achievements, controversies, and enduring influence, and his death has prompted a re-evaluation of his role in Zambia's history. As president from 2015 to 2021, Lungu oversaw significant infrastructure development, including a $10 billion road building program that connected rural areas and boosted trade. His administration also invested in alternative energy, such as solar power, to address Zambia's electricity shortages, and promoted agricultural diversification to reduce reliance on copper mining. Lungu's constitutional amendments, which reduced presidential powers and introduced a 50% plus one electoral threshold, were seen as progressive steps toward democratic consolidation. His promotion of gender equality, with women holding key cabinet positions, was another highlight, earning praise from gender advocacy groups. Lungu's personal style, described by supporters like electoral expert guest Nirenda as simple, humble, and accessible, made him a relatable figure. His rise from a modest background to the presidency resonated with many Zambians, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas. His faith, often expressed through public prayers and engagement with churches, aligned with Zambia's Christian identity, cementing his image as a man of the people. However, Lungu's presidency was not without significant challenges. His government's invocation of emergency powers in 2017 to quell unrest, the enactment of the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Act in 2021, and restrictions on opposition rallies and media outlets drew criticism from human rights organizations like Amnesty International. The economic downturn during his tenure, culminating in Zambia's default on Eurobond debt in November 2020, eroded public confidence and contributed to his electoral defeat to Hichilema in 2021. Allegations of corruption, particularly related to procurement contracts and mining deals, dogged his administration, with critics arguing that his leadership tolerated financial mismanagement and political thuggery. The circumstances of Lungu's death and the funeral dispute have added layers of complexity to his legacy. The PF and Lungu's family allege that Hichilema's government restricted Lungu's access to medical treatment abroad, citing delays in approving his travel in 2024 due to security concerns. They claim this exacerbated his health issues, a charge the government denies, stating that Lungu received state support for medical trips. The family's insistence on a private funeral, based on Lungu's alleged wish to exclude Hichilema, has framed Lungu as a figure who remained defiant against his political rival until the end. This narrative resonates with PF supporters, who view Lungu as a martyr of political persecution. Conversely, Hichilema's supporters argue that Lungu's legacy is tarnished by his governance failures and his post-presidency attempts to undermine the UPND government. They point to his active role in PF politics, including his bid to contest the 2026 election, later barred by the Constitutional Court, as evidence of his unwillingness to retire gracefully. The funeral dispute risks overshadowing Lungu's contributions, with constitutional lawyer John Sangwa warning that the absence of clear legal guidelines for presidential funerals could diminish the dignity of future leaders' legacies. Lungu's legacy will likely be remembered through two lenses: as a transformative leader who championed infrastructure and inclusivity, and as a polarizing figure whose tenure deepened Zambia's political and economic challenges. The funeral controversy has amplified these divisions, ensuring that Lungu's memory remains a contested space in Zambia's national discourse. How political leaders and citizens are responding. The responses from political leaders and citizens to Lungu's death and the funeral crisis reflect Zambia's polarized political landscape and the urgency of addressing systemic gaps in national mourning protocols. Political leaders. Hakainde Hichilema and the UPND. Hichilema's administration has positioned itself as committed to a dignified state funeral, with Foreign Minister Malambo Haimbi emphasizing that Lungu's death is a national matter requiring state oversight. Secretary to the Cabinet Patrick Kangwa has detailed the the government's logistical efforts, including securing military honors and coordinating with South African authorities. However, the UPND faces accusations of insensitivity, particularly from the PF, for allegedly ignoring Lungu's wishes. Patriotic Front (PF) leaders, including Secretary General Raphael Nakasinda and former First Lady Esther Lungu, have rallied behind the family's call for a private funeral. The PF organized a memorial service in Pretoria and directed mourners to its Lusaka headquarters, framing these actions as a defense of Lungu's dignity. The party has accused Hichilema of politicizing the funeral to marginalize the PF ahead of the 2026 elections. Other political parties, the Republican Progressive Party (RPP), has taken a hardline stance, demanding the arrest of those holding hostage Lungu's remains, reflecting broader opposition frustration with the government's handling of the crisis. Smaller parties, like the Socialist Party, have called for reconciliation, urging both sides to prioritize national unity. Civil society and legal experts, the Law Association of Zambia (LAZ), has advocated for a state funeral that respects Lungu's service, while constitutional lawyer John Sangwa has proposed legislative reforms to establish clear protocols for presidential funerals. Social commentator Laura Mitty has criticized the Lungu family's actions, arguing that their insistence on a private funeral risks alienating Zambians who wish to mourn collectively. Citizens, PF supporters. In PF strongholds like Kitwe and Dola, citizens have held vigils and marches, demanding respect for Lungu's wishes. Some have expressed anger on X, with users like at Copperbelt Youth accusing Hichilema of desecrating Lungu's memory. These sentiments are fueled by the perception that Lungu was unfairly targeted by the UPND government. UPND supporters. In southern and western provinces, UPND supporters have rallied behind Hichilema, praising his efforts to maintain order. X posts from users like at Zambia Forward highlight his economic achievements as evidence of his commitment to Zambia's progress, contrasting this with Lungu's tenure. Neutral voices. Many Zambians, particularly in rural areas, have expressed sadness over the politicization of Lungu's death. Church leaders, including the Council of Churches in Zambia, have condemned the mockery of the funeral process, calling for prayer and reconciliation. Traditional leaders, such as Chief Mpazini of the Ngoni people, have urged calm, emphasizing Lungu's role as a unifying figure. Media and analysts. Zambian media outlets, such as ZNBC and The Mass, have provided extensive coverage, with editorials calling for a resolution that honors Lungu's legacy. Political analyst Michael Zephaniah Fairai has criticized the government's communication strategy, arguing that it has allowed the PF to control the narrative. International observers, including the African Union, have expressed condolences but refrained from commenting on the funeral dispute. Zambia's historic transition, the death of Edgar Lungu and its implications. The death of former President Edgar Chagwa Lungu on June 5, 2025, and the subsequent national and political developments represent a defining moment in Zambia's history. Whether one supports President Hakainde Hichilema (HH) or the late Edgar Lungu, this period marks a significant transition, exposing deep political divisions, testing institutional frameworks, and prompting a national reckoning on unity, legacy, and governance. Lungu's passing, coupled with the contentious funeral arrangements, has thrust Zambia into a moment of reflection and potential transformation, with implications for its democratic stability, national identity, and future political trajectory as the 2026 elections approach. The official statement by President Hakainde Hichilema. On June 19, 2025, President Hakainde Hichilema addressed the nation in a televised speech to mark the end of a 14-day national mourning period for Edgar Lungu, Zambia's sixth president, who died in Pretoria, South Africa, at age 68. The statement was a delicate balancing act, aiming to honor Lungu's contributions, address the contentious funeral disputes, and call for national unity in a deeply polarized climate. Hichilema expressed condolences to Lungu's family, the Patriotic Front (PF) party, and all Zambians, acknowledging Lungu's service as president from 2015 to 2021 and his role in shaping Zambia's development. He emphasized values of compassion, dignity, and unity, urging citizens to rise above political differences to honor Lungu's memory. The statement detailed the government's efforts to coordinate with the Lungu family and South African authorities for the repatriation of Lungu's remains and a state funeral scheduled for June 22, 2025, with full military honors. Hichilema revealed that an agreement had been reached with the family, but last-minute changes by the family disrupted the planned repatriation on June 18, 2025, leaving the government unable to proceed as intended. He expressed regret over the delay, noting the logistical complexities of organizing a state funeral for a former head of state, especially given the international context of Lungu's death in South Africa. Hichilema also addressed accusations from the PF and Lungu's family that his administration had mishandled the process or disrespected Lungu's wishes, particularly the claim that Lungu had explicitly requested Hichilema's non-involvement in his funeral. Without directly refuting these claims, Hichilema stressed that the funeral was a national matter, governed by state protocols, and cited the involvement of senior officials like Foreign Minister Malambo Haimbi and Secretary to the Cabinet Patrick Kangwa in negotiations. He called for calm, urging Zambians to avoid divisive rhetoric and work toward a resolution that respects both Lungu's legacy and Zambia's unity. The statement's significance lies in its attempt to navigate a crisis that transcends personal or political political rivalries. Hichilema's measured tone aimed to project statesmanship, but the mention of the family's disruptions hinted at underlying tensions. The address underscored the government's commitment to institutional processes, while acknowledging the emotional weight of Lungu's death for many Zambians. This moment tests Hichilema's leadership, as his ability to resolve the funeral dispute will shape public perception of his administration and influence Zambia's political stability. Public reaction from across Zambia. Lungu's death has elicited a spectrum of emotions across Zambia, from profound grief to frustration and division, reflecting the country's polarized political landscape and its cultural reverence for mourning. As a Christian nation, Zambia observes mourning periods with solemnity, and Lungu's passing prompted an outpouring of tributes, with radio stations playing gospel music and communities holding vigils. However, the dispute over funeral arrangements, pitting the government's push for a state funeral against the Lungu family's preference for a private ceremony, has transformed this grief into a national controversy. The government designated a state-owned lodge in Lusaka as the official mourning venue, while the PF directed supporters to its headquarters, creating confusion among citizens, particularly in rural areas with limited access to information. Many Zambians were unsure where to pay their respects, and the prolonged delay in repatriating Lungu's remains, still in South Africa as of June 19, 2025, added to the public's frustration. In urban centers like Lusaka, Kitwe, and Ndola, PF supporters organized marches and candlelight vigils, chanting slogans like "Respect ECL's wishes," while UPND strongholds in southern and western provinces saw gatherings supporting Hichilema's call for unity. Social media, particularly X, has been a barometer of public sentiment. Supporters of Hichilema, such as at Katso_Lazarine, praised his leadership, arguing that his push for a state funeral reflects respect for Lungu's national role. Conversely, PF-aligned accounts like at PF Youth Wing accused the government of arrogance and disrespect, amplifying the family's claim that Hichilema ignored Lungu's dying wish. An open letter by Thandai Keti Zingoma, published in the Zambian Observer, went viral, accusing Hichilema of driving Lungu to his grave through years of alleged harassment, including travel restrictions and legal threats. The letter resonated with Lungu's base, particularly in Copperbelt and northern provinces, but drew rebuttals from UPND supporters who cited Lungu's economic mismanagement and authoritarian tendencies as justification for Hichilema's actions. Rural communities, less exposed to political rhetoric, have focused on traditional mourning practices, with chiefs and church leaders organizing prayers. However, even here, the lack of clarity about funeral arrangements has caused distress, as prolonged delays in burial are culturally frowned upon. The division in public sentiment mirrors Zambia's urban-rural and political divides, with Lungu's death becoming a flashpoint for unresolved tensions from the 2021 election, where Hichilema defeated Lungu amid allegations of rigging and political persecution. This public reaction underscores the transition's historical weight. Lungu's death has not only mourned a former leader, but also exposed the fragility of national unity, challenging Zambia to reconcile its differences in a moment of collective grief. What this means for the legacy of Edgar Lungu. Edgar Lungu's legacy is a complex interplay of achievements, controversies, and enduring influence, and his death has sparked a national debate about how he will be remembered. As president from 2015 to 2021, Lungu oversaw significant infrastructure projects, including a $10 billion road network that improved connectivity in rural areas like Machinga and Luapula. His administration promoted agricultural diversification, with initiatives like the Farmer Input Support Program, FISP, and invested in solar energy to address power shortages. Constitutional reforms under Lungu, such as the 50%+1 electoral threshold and limits on presidential powers, were hailed as democratic milestones. His appointment of women to key roles, including Vice President Inange Waina and several cabinet ministers, earned praise for advancing gender representation. Lungu's personal charisma, described by supporters like Ges Nyrenda as humble and approachable, made him a beloved figure, particularly among urban youth and church communities. His public displays of faith, including national prayer days, resonated with Zambia's Christian majority. However, his presidency was marred by economic challenges, including Zambia's 2020 Eurobond default, which deepened poverty and unemployment. Critics, including Hichilema, accused Lungu of tolerating corruption, citing opaque mining and procurement deals. His government's use of emergency powers in 2017, the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Act, and restrictions on opposition rallies drew condemnation from human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, who labeled his leadership as increasingly authoritarian. The circumstances of Lungu's death and funeral have added a new dimension to his legacy. The PF and Lungu's family allege that Hichilema's government restricted Lungu's access to medical treatment abroad, citing a 2024 incident where his travel was delayed for security reasons. They claim this contributed to his declining health, a charge the government denies, asserting that Lungu received state support for medical trips. The family's insistence on a private funeral, based on Lungu's alleged wish to exclude Hichilema, paints him as a figure who remained defiant against his rival until the end. This narrative has galvanized PF supporters, who view Lungu as a martyr of political persecution. Conversely, Hichilema supporters argue that Lungu's legacy is tainted by his governance failures and post-presidency politicking, including his attempt to contest the 2026 election despite a constitutional court ruling ruling barring him. The funeral dispute risks overshadowing his achievements, with constitutional lawyer John Sangwa noting that the lack of legal clarity for presidential funerals could diminish the dignity of future leaders' legacies. Lungu's legacy will likely be dual: a transformative leader for his supporters, remembered for infrastructure and inclusivity, and a polarizing figure for critics, associated with economic decline and democratic backsliding. This moment, fraught with controversy, will shape how history judges him. How political leaders and citizens are responding. The responses from political leaders and citizens reflect the depth of Zambia's political divisions and the urgency of addressing the crisis with sensitivity and foresight. Political leaders. Hakainde Hichilema and the UPND. Hichilema's administration has prioritized a state funeral, with Foreign Minister Malambo Haimbi arguing that Lungu's death concerns all Zambians, not just his family. Secretary to the Cabinet Patrick Kangwa detailed logistical efforts, including securing a military guard of honor and liaising with South Africa. The UPND faces accusations of insensitivity, particularly from the PF, but maintains that state protocols must guide the process. Patriotic Front PF leaders, including Raphael Nakasinda and former First Lady Esther Lungu, have aligned with the family's push for a private funeral, organizing a memorial service in Pretoria and directing mourners to PF headquarters. The party accuses Hichilema of politicizing the funeral to weaken the PF's influence ahead of 2026, framing the dispute as a continuation of Lungu's alleged persecution. Other political actors. The Republican Progressive Party (RPP) has demanded accountability for delays in repatriating Lungu's remains, reflecting broader opposition frustration. Smaller parties, like the Socialist Party, have called for dialogue, while civil society groups like the Law Association of Zambia (LAZ) advocate for a dignified state funeral. Constitutional lawyer John Sangwa has proposed a legal framework to prevent future disputes, highlighting systemic gaps. Traditional and religious leaders. Chiefs like Pazini of Ngoni and church bodies like the Council of Churches in Zambia have called for reconciliation, condemning the mockery of the funeral process. Their influence is critical in calming tensions, given their cultural authority. Citizens. PF supporters. In PF strongholds like Copperbelt and Luapula, citizens have held protests and vigils, with some burning UPND regalia in Kitwe to express anger. Ex-posts from users like @Zambian Patriot demand respect for Lungu's wishes, framing Hichilema as disrespectful. UPND supporters. In southern and western provinces, UPND rallies have praised Hichilema's economic reforms, such as debt restructuring with China, and supported his call for unity. Users like @Zambia Forward on X argue that Lungu's legacy should not overshadow Hichilema's progress. Neutral voices. Many Zambians, particularly in rural areas, are distressed by the politicization of Lungu's death. Church-led prayers in Eastern Province and community gatherings in Northwestern Province reflect a desire for closure. Social commentator Laura Mitty has criticized both sides, urging a focus on national mourning. Media and analysts. ZNBC and The Mast have provided balanced coverage, while editorials in the Zambia Daily Mail call for legislative reform. Political analyst Michael Zephaniah Fairai argues that the government's communication failures have allowed the PF to dominate the narrative, while international observers, including the Southern African Development Community (SADC), have offered condolences but avoided commenting on the dispute. These responses highlight the challenge of uniting Zambia during a moment of grief and political tension, with implications for social cohesion and democratic governance. A significant transition in Zambia's national history. The death of Edgar Lungu and the ensuing funeral controversy mark a profound transition in Zambia's history, regardless of one's political allegiance to Hichilema or Lungu. This moment encapsulates several critical dimensions. Political polarization. The Hichilema-Lungu rivalry, rooted in 5 electoral contests and culminating in the 2021 election, has shaped Zambia's political landscape. Lungu's death and the funeral dispute have reignited these tensions, testing Zambia's ability to manage political transitions peacefully. The outcome, whether compromise or escalation, will influence trust in democratic institutions as the 2026 elections loom. Institutional gaps. The absence of clear legal protocols for presidential funerals, as noted by John Sangwa, has exposed vulnerabilities in Zambia's governance framework. This crisis could catalyze reforms to ensure dignified farewells for future leaders, strengthening institutional resilience. Cultural sensitivities. Zambia's Christian and traditional values emphasize respect for the dead, and the delay in Lungu's burial has caused widespread unease. Resolving this dispute in a way that honors cultural norms could restore public confidence and reinforce national identity. Leadership test for Hichilema. Hichilema's handling of the crisis will define his presidency. His economic successes, including debt restructuring and infrastructure investments, contrast with perceptions of insensitivity among Lungu's supporters. A successful resolution could bolster his re-election prospects, while failure risks alienating a significant portion of the population. PF's future. Lungu's death leaves the PF without its unifying figure, potentially triggering a leadership crisis. The party's ability to leverage this moment to rally its base without alienating moderates will determine its viability in 2026.